Hello, everyone, and welcome to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. I'm editor-in-chief, Tristan, and I am joined with our poetry editor, Lynne Sargent, our design editor, Jonathan S., and our nonfiction editor, Raima Larter. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
So today we're just going to have a kind of special podcast. It's the 5th year since we started publishing. I almost said since we started recording, and that would not be right. Since we started publishing Utopia Science Fiction. It's been an impressive journey. We have released several podcasts, probably about 100 plus stories and poems that we've published. So I'm just going to take a bit of a moment and see if anyone has any past memories of stories that they've worked through with Utopia they'd like to talk about.
I can throw some out there. I think, first of all, of Nadine's story, A Time for Blooming, which we had this year over 2 issues. It was a fairly long story, but it was worth it to have, more space to put that in there. That was a beautiful story. And the other one that just immediately comes to mind, we just published this week, High from Shelling Point, when I ran across that in the submission queue, I was just delighted. I was actually laughing out loud as I read that first time. So very happy to see that one done.
Yeah, there's so many poems that I've worked on that I'm just so proud of the poets. And I feel like I have a very easy job because usually there's like pretty light to no editing. But I really remember, I think this was like one of the first poems that I published with you guys. It was We Fly by Jerry Lynne. And I remember being like, I really like this poem, but I feel like maybe it would be better as a prose poem. And so like I wrote Jerry and I was, how would you feel about this being a prose poem? And I don't think we'd had a prose poem at that point, or at least not while I was editor. And she was like, yeah, I actually really like that idea. And so she sent back in this like totally rewritten version, and it was just absolutely stunning. And I really like that kind of stuff. I really like the different things we get to publish. I remember too, there was, I think it was Colleen Anderson, How the Big Bang Ended, which was just an entirely found poem of different newspaper headlines and stuff. And it was just so creative. And I'm always in awe of poets who do that kind of thing. Cause like I just do, when I write in my own time, it's basically just boring free verse stuff. So I always really appreciate people that send in really interesting different things and different styles and different forms and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I really liked about this High from Shelling Point was it was this epistolary form. The whole thing were letters back to people on Earth from the character that was leaving Earth and going somewhere else. And I thought that was, I've seen, obviously more other stories that are written that way, but this one just really worked so well since it was this one voice from way out in the universe writing back to us here. I just thought it was wonderful. It was really very creative way to do it.
Yeah, I love some of the experimental work that we get into, we get submitted to us. And I'm always divided because experimental work can sometimes be very, very difficult to parse through, but when you get it right, when you get something that really like works, like Shelling Point or Effany Gale gave us a submission that was a bunch of episodes from a show that was never made. It was just a show. It was just the synopsises of like several seasons worth of this imaginary sci-fi show, which was really quite impressive.
Yeah, and it was really fun to go through and format it because it was a little bit different from what we usually did. And I want to see that show made soon.
That was what I thought. I want to watch this one. Yeah, someday.
I always enjoyed one of the first stories that we published, Tremendous by John Saul, was really, really impressive. I'm not entirely sure what it was. It was a letter, a back and forth communication between someone and Tom Hanks, an asteroid named Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
It was a fun one.
I wonder if there is an asteroid named Tom Hanks. There probably is.
So I think that there is an asteroid named, it's asteroid 12818, Tom Hanks, discovered April 13th, 1996 at the University of Arizona. But I feel like there's so many different ways to tell a story.
One of the ones that stood out to me, and this was very early on, I think it was either towards the end of our first year or towards the beginning of our second year, toward the the Olympus Mons, which was sort of Tour de France on Mars.
Yes.
And it really spoke to me because my mother, who had passed away the previous year, in her last few years of life, she had become a real fan of cycling and watched the tour religiously.
I know
Yes.
that when we're sort of like deciding our issue themes for the year, we like to pick themes that we've sort of seen in the slush before. And I know that like this year in our June issue, we're gonna have a Xeno Olympics issue. Was that issue inspired by that story at all? Like seeing that story and like publishing it before?
I had sort of the same question, but I think we actually have the Olympics going on this coming summer, right? So that might be partly to blame.
Yeah, I think it was inspired by that. But just going back to that April issue, we still get compliments on the cover art that Jonathan did for that, which was really quite special.
Yeah, it was a nice little tribute. It was fun kind of working with Daz 3E at the time, just trying to combine these cycling poses with the spacesuits that I had. I don't think I ever would have thought to combine those things before.
I feel like some of the stories that stick with me are stories that we've ended up having to reject. There are a couple stories that we received, and I still think about them years later, months later, the characters, the kinds of ideas that were going on there. And we ended up ultimately rejecting some of these because, we didn't have the room. The writing wasn't quite up to some of the other levels that we were receiving. And sometimes it's just not quite the right story at the right time. But I can remember a few. There's one that I still think back on. We received early on about Quetzalcoatl and like a leaf blowing business. It was very interesting. Does anyone else remember stories that they rejected or poems that they rejected that they also still think about?
Yeah, so I know that we got some like mostly the poems that I reject that I think there's lots of poems I reject that I love that I think are fabulous, but they're honestly just like a little bit too sad for Utopia. I'm like, oh, this is too depressing. We can't really do this. So I remember, I think Yulia Verita had submitted really interesting sort of like Cold War inspired space race type poems, and I was like, I love this. I love your language. I love what you're doing, but it's just a little bit too cold Siberian winter in terms of like melancholy tone over it all. But then it was really cool because like I feel like a lot of times when I get to send out those rejections where it's like, I really loved your piece, but sorry. We do get repeat submitters, and then it's always really nice to be able to publish people after the fact that you're like, oh, I'm sorry I had to reject this one, but I'm glad that we finally got one that was the good fit for the magazine.
Yeah, I think about a story, and I'm not going to get the author's name correct here, so I won't even try, but it was about a moon colony. And I loved it and passed it on up to our fiction editor, and eventually it got rejected. But he sent it in for an editing session as I think probably his Kickstarter reward. So I got to work with this Christopher Mucato or something. I thought that was a beautiful story. I really loved it, and was very happy to be able to work with him to work, get the writing to a much higher level. I don't know whatever happened with that story. I hope he sent it again somewhere else and got it published or will someday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's always nice too when you can like work with the author and you can kind of work together to take a good story and just make it absolutely amazing. Like I've had some great experiences working with. I'm blanking on the title of the piece now, which is bad on me. But it was a few years ago. We published a story by Elena Gomel, and I really liked it. It had a lot of like it kind of was reminiscent of Blood Music by Greg Bear and a few other things too that I remembered. But it was just this beautiful piece that wasn't quite there, but we were able to go back and forth and exchange a few drafts, and the final product was just absolutely gorgeous. It was one of those things that I wish we could have included in the anthology that's coming out, but didn't quite have enough room for it. But that experience of working and synthesis of building a story and just helping the author unlock exactly what it is they're trying to tell and to tell the story the best way they can or to write the poem to express it the best way that they can.
So I'm sure a question that might come up is how did this magazine start?
Ah, yes. The origin stories. I just remember I was working at two libraries at the time. And for the longest time, I was trying to find books that, I wanted to read. Or I was just reading what was coming out, what was being put on the shelf. And I was always sort of disappointed that it was always these dark, grimdark, depressing, dystopian stories that are being put out in the world. And I'm a firm believer that what we read shapes what the world becomes. So I decided maybe I could do something. Maybe I could create a magazine that focused on utopia, the counteragent, and put some more hopeful stories out there. Put some more stories that, we might want to live in, inspire us to believe in a better future. So I started Utopia Science Fiction, and I was not sure how it was going to do. I figured, most times people start a magazine and it goes for maybe a year or two, and then it collapses because it's a lot of work, it's expensive, and there's a lot of things you need to navigate and learn. But here we are 5 years later and still going strong. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity.
How did you come to work with Tristan, Jonathan? Because I feel like you've been with the team the longest now, besides Tristan, obviously.
Yeah, so I kind of knew him through Star Trek Online. He had been running some role playing in there, and there were a couple of points where he needed some artwork from me, and so I happily did that. And when he was starting to put the magazine together, he sent me a draft. I think it was in Microsoft Word at the time.
Probably,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. And my first thought was, you know what? I can do this professionally. So, so I happen to have the old Adobe software that they had basically put out in order to combat the piracy situation, and so I started working with that to give at least a little bit of polish to the first few drafts, and we just kept going.
So, Lynn, I had the same question for you. Out of the group of the four of us, I'm the newest, I think I just passed my 1 year anniversary just a couple days ago with the magazine. So, yeah, I don't know the origin stories of anybody. So, how did you get involved, Lynn?
So I think Tristan had put a call out that he was looking for a poetry editor. I had been slushing at Flash Fiction Online for I think about 2 years at that point, and obviously I love short fiction too. Like I love and I read and I write both poetry and short fiction and longer stuff for that matter. I had really been wanting to like have a little bit more of that editorial control and also like to get some experience editing other people's poetry. Cause like I'd obviously done, like critique groups and stuff like that, where like your peers, you're sharing feedback back and forth. I'd been doing that since university. But like I just thought it would be really cool to like have a little bit more control as compared to like just being a slush reader, and also being able to like work specifically with poetry, because like for me, like I love all the different kinds of things, but poetry is also like just really special, and I feel like people don't love poetry as much as they ought to, and also as much as I do. So I was like, okay, this is my chance to like do this thing that I really love, and I was really excited by the idea of Utopia. Like Tristan said, it seems like there's a lot of grimdark stuff out there. I read both fantasy and science fiction, but there's definitely a skew in the market right now towards fantasy. So I just like wasn't getting enough of that. And so I was really happy to come on board. I grew up reading Asimov and R.J. Sawyer and like all that sort of stuff. So it was really great to have that opportunity. And basically like right away, Tristan gave me like, there was like, I think 2 months where I was like sort of checking in with him at every point. But since then I've been having very free reign to like sort of do what I want to do with the position. And that's just it's been super lovely. Like I love getting to promote authors' work. I love getting to like give poets money. Like I know it's not me giving them money, but it's, oh yeah, because I loved a thing, you got money. And like that's just the best feeling in the world. So it's been a really good ride.
Yeah, but poets don't get paid very often or very much.
Yeah. Definitely. So it's good to like have more of that out there. And also I think I definitely pushed for not that Tristan like has ever sort of undervalued poetry, but I definitely feel like I am very vocal about being like more poetry, more poetry is important. Paying our poets more is important, and like getting to like bang that little doll drum, but also have it be listened to is really good.
Well, I feel like everyone who volunteers here, the entire staff, all have a very good idea of what they're looking for. So I usually go with what people suggest because you all have a very good idea of what works well, what fits. So I'm very happy to have all of you on board with Utopia. And Raima, do you want to talk about, you just took on a new assignment
Yeah.
as the nonfiction editor.
Yeah, that's pretty new. As I said, my anniversary date was like November 1st for joining the staff. But actually, I've been involved with Utopia for a few years. I submitted a story as a writer back, I think, during volume 2. And that's what was my first introduction to it. And I, like Lynne said, was just really drawn to Tristan's philosophy, which is why I submitted my story. I thought, I agree with that, that we need more stories that paint a future that we're proud of. So I'd been a fan, from the beginning, pretty much, and had been reading for other journals that were not science fiction. These were literary magazines that gave me a lot of experience reading just general short fiction. But when Tristan asked for volunteers to write in to read fiction submissions, I just jumped at that because that was what I was writing and that was what I wanted to read and wanted to really help improve the landscape of fiction, science fiction today. To go back to the way I remember it when I was reading Asimov and Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke and all of those wonderful folks back then. Andre Norton was my childhood favorite author. And then after several months of reading fiction, I started making comments to Tristan about the quality of the nonfiction. Since my background is in science, I was a science professor and I was a freelance science writer for several, like 6 or 7 years before doing this. So I had a lot of experience with writing about science for the public as well as teaching. And I was concerned about the quality. So because I suggested that we maybe try to improve the quality, I got this new job as nonfiction editor. I told this story to my son over the weekend, and he said, "Well, that's what happens when you complain, then you get the job, right?" And so that's what happened. And I've kind of scrambling around trying to get my legs under me with this thing, but we have had some couple of issues now where I've actually been involved with that, and I'm pretty happy with it and starting to feel like I'm a little bit more on top of this and be able to look ahead somewhat, try to solicit some articles and get some kind of like plan for the next few issues as opposed to just kind of flying by the seat of my pants, which is what I've been doing for a few months. Yeah.
You had a great interview with Andrew Fracknoy, though.
Yeah, well, it helps that he's a delightful person. I mean, I actually didn't know that. I feel really proud of that one because I discovered this guy in the submission queue. He was submitted a fictional story to us, and I said, "Wait a minute, look at his credentials. We could do something with him." And I actually asked him to write a nonfiction article, and he, said he didn't really have time to do that. But I just kept pressing the issue with him, and he eventually agreed to sit for an interview, and it was great. He's really been involved with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence from the beginning of that organization, decades now, and is an astronomer, so who knows a lot of science. So yeah, I can't take credit for the great interview. It was him.
I think that's one of the great things about science fiction in general is the science part. But just as in terms of like Utopia, and we're able to both publish fiction and poetry and really interesting interviews and articles with the science community too. So it's nice to have that kind of broad scope.
Yes.
And I think building the community as well, like the fact that, I think that like there's some writers that we've published both poetry and their short fiction. When you publish a writer, you create a relationship there, and then you get to sort of cheerlead them on if they publish other things or if things are nominated for awards. We see repeat submitters, and like you sort of get to see how they grow and change as writers and how their work is growing and changing. And I think that's really awesome too, like getting to sort of see people in different roles and also just like make that connection with them, because that feels very utopic to me as well. We're creating our tiny little publishing utopia that is still publishing but also utopia.
Yes.
I like that.
So here's a question for all of you. How do you see things differently volunteering here now as when you started in the beginning? Or what are things that you've learned to do? I will speak for myself, and I have learned an awful lot about like formatting and trying to get deadlines in. But just all of the work that goes behind getting the segments of the magazine together after it's been accepted, after it's been edited, and things like that.
Definitely like keeping notes and keeping records. Like it's as much as I love all the things we publish, it's sometimes hard to remember. Like I'm a person who's like terrible with names. So like it's that memory piece is sometimes a problem for me, especially because we accept something and then it doesn't come out for a while. Or if I'm trying to remember the next year when we're like nominating for awards. So keeping notes on when I'm recommending things to accept to you, Tristan, I send all those like little emails. It's like, here's what I think we should accept and why. So like just keeping those notes around and like having them sort of like in an organized folder so I can refer back to them later and be like, yes, this is the piece, this is who wrote it, and this is why I loved it. And having that all in one place is I think like a really good future proofing tool for me.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what I've learned is mostly streamlining the workflow. Because, like, when I first started, I didn't know what I was doing. I also didn't quite get that because I was using older graphic design software that I couldn't import the newer Word files. And so I was, at least for the first 2 years, I was manually formatting everything, doing all of the bolds, all of the italics.
Wow.
Each story at a time, and it actually took like at least a day to go through each story. And of course, once I figured out what was going on with that, I felt so stupid. But these are the kinds of things that you kind of have to learn on the job. I like to think that I've also become a little bit of a better artist, having done some artwork for the magazine.
The new creature feature is so cool, and like that was such a great idea that like you brought to the table, I think, because of the experimentation you'd been doing with your art.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I really like that new combination of art and story. I think it's great.
Yeah, and I was sort of inspired by one of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Far Beyond the Stars.
That's the one where he's a science fiction writer.
That is one of the
Yes.
best Star Trek
I
episodes
love
out.
it. Ever.
Yeah,
Yes.
and of course it sort of starts out with artists played by J.G. Hertzler, showing off all the drawings, and all of the writers are picking which ones will inspire their next story for the magazine. And so I wanted to sort of push that a little bit too.
Cool.
Plus, it gave me an excuse to do a drawing for the magazine every issue.
Well, I think what's really cool too is that like as a writer, and like you hear writers talk a lot about how one of like the most exciting things that can happen when a magazine publishes their work is if there's art to go along with it. And I think that we do a really good job on the art side, but I also think it's like really cool to like have an artist create a piece and then have a writer sort of illustrate it with their words, if that makes sense. So like I think it's it's really playing in that space where doing art with other people is just really fun, and like having people do art about your thing is also really fun.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that I have learned in this position that I hadn't really appreciated in the other volunteer reader positions I'd had is how rewarding it is to work with writers even when you're rejecting their work. So being able to send an email to somebody saying what was good about the story, even though we're not publishing it, and then have a nice response from them, a grateful response for the feedback. I mean, that's always how I felt as a writer. If I got any kind of feedback at all, it was amazing. And so being able to do that, which we can't all the time, but much of the time we try to give feedback, and then feeling like I'm helping another person achieve their dreams is really great. So, and I didn't expect that to happen with taking this on, but it has.
I mean, sometimes the worst thing you can hear as a writer or as an artist is nothing.
Yeah.
Just absolute silence.
That happens a lot more in a whole bunch of, not just writing, but in a whole bunch of different areas. And I mean, that's also one of the reasons I like to stress, at least some kind of feedback. It seems like the best kind of thing to do, both for the writer and for the organization.
If we can manage it. It's hard.
I think that's the other thing I've learned is just how to balance workflow, or how to try to balance workflow. I think it's an ongoing process. You're always learning new things.
Well, sometimes too is hard if there's nothing to say. Sometimes you can say like, "Oh, this is good. It's just a bad fit," or you can say like, "Oh, like your language is really great, but like the ending needed work," or whatever. But sometimes it's this was a fine poem. Like this was a fine poem. It's on theme. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's just space often, right? Like space is the big thing.
Yeah.
Like Lynne said earlier, sometimes the story is just a little too dark, and the ending is not very hopeful. But it's a wonderful story and makes you think a lot. And those were easy letters to write because I could always encourage the person to submit it somewhere else. It may not be right for us, but some of these were really great, and I do hope that they took that advice and sent it somewhere else.
Definitely.
And I will say something that I've been learning on this issue in particular, or not this issue, but this volume, is I've decided to switch up the software. And so I'm literally learning a new program as I go. It can be frustrating because Adobe, they have the capacity to do bug fixes and quality assurances and, have a really, really super polished product for it. However, I have a strong objection to the subscription service.
Yeah.
Because it's expensive, and if you can't pay, then you can't use the software.
Yeah.
But this stuff has a few minor bugs that I have to work through, and much swearing has ensued these past two issues.
They turn out right in the end, so that's also a good thing. I mean,
yeah, and I am proud of the work that I've managed to do so far. So
here's a question for everyone: setting aside the past and looking to the future, what are some things you'd like to see in maybe the next 5 years?
So like two things that I'd love to see. I'd love to see us do disabled futures issue at some point. That's something that is like near and dear to my heart, and I would love to see us do at some point. I know we did a queer issue last year, but like I think that those sort of like minority voices and like imagining futures specifically for those groups of people is really important, and like also elevating those voices in the magazine. And I'd also love to see, like, I know it's not poetry, like poetry got a huge pay bump this year, so I feel like we are in a pretty okay place, even if like obviously authors deserve all the money for their work. But I'd also love to see if we could get to SIFWA pro rates with a short fiction too. That would be awesome.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is I would love to see the pay rate go up so that it is eligible for that, for the writers would get eligibility. Another thing that I don't know how popular this would be with anybody, but this is, and maybe just more my generation, but I love print and instead of digital. I really like reading things on paper, even though I read lots of stuff online and on my, Kindle app and that sort of thing. I just would love to see more of that. I'm really glad the anthology is going to be printed. It would be nice to see more issues in both digital and print form if that's possible. So I know this is an expensive dream, but still, I would like it.
I suppose one thing in that direction that would also be cool would be like if something we printed was like selected for a year's best anthology, because then it would like end up in print.
Yeah.
And I will say I've been producing each issue print ready.
Yes, exactly. You just have to print it, right?
Right.
And pay for the printing.
Because Printing is expensive.
Yes.
Yes. So I would love to see more diversity. Love to be able to pay authors more and just, grow the magazine in that way that we can continue to perpetuate the support that we can give to artists and authors.
And one thing I would like to see is more art in the magazine.
Yeah.
Like, I would love to see some more art paired with stories. And
Yeah, I'm happy about the anthology that's coming out December 1st for a few reasons. One, we do have some unique art pieces that we've added. We have a lot more art in there. And it's also in print. So
Yes.
it may be a sneak peek at what's to come, hopefully in the next 5 years for the regular issues, if we're lucky and things keep going well, and so far they are.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to see how things have grown and how recognition has grown, and also how our ability to support writers has grown. It is pretty awesome, as you say, especially because usually that magazine trajectory is 1 year, maybe 2 years, and then it peters out. And I think that we've been able to keep up a consistent schedule. Things are done in a timely manner, and that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the big hope, is that we continue for another 5 years or more. Because, every day you hear about another long-running literary magazine, not just in the science fiction world, but, in general, going under, having their funding pulled by the university that's publishing them or whatever. I heard about another one today. So, and it's kind of scary to think that it could happen to us too, but we just got to prevent that.
I'm always amazed by the work of the staff, but I am also always amazed and humbled by the people who read Utopia Science Fiction, who buy issues, who support and submit to us. They always come through to help us survive, and that's really important too.
We wouldn't survive without them, right?
Absolutely not. Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, we have our anthology coming out. It has close to 60 poems and stories, and some interviews that we're republishing, and some interviews with all of us. So lots of fun things to look forward to. But we weren't, of course, once again, size comes into it, and we weren't able to get every story that we suggested into the anthology. So here's a question for you all. What is one story that we've published that didn't make it into the anthology that you think, deserves a shout out or you would like to see included? I have a lot more than one.
I think one of the cool ones that I remember that didn't make it in was we got a really cool poem a number of years ago called Ode on a Martian Urn. And it's just a exact meter and rhyme scheme copy of Ode on a Grecian Urn, but it's all about artifacts found on Mars and stuff. And I thought that one was really cool, really original. It had that homage, but the homage was done really well. It was very technical. It was obviously very, very difficult to write, but then it was this very classic sci-fi concept that was still very hopeful. And I thought that was a great poem that I think we basically just went through and we were like, all right, we have to pick one poem from each issue. And I forget what we picked over that poem, but that was one that I think didn't make it in, but still sticks out in my mind.
Yeah, putting together the anthology gave me a chance to go back and read some of the stories from the earlier volumes that had been published before I even knew about Utopia Science Fiction as an entity. So one of the very first stories published was called I Girl Friday. And I think that it is in the anthology, actually. It's not one of the ones that got bumped out. I really like that. I still think about that story. I mean, it needed, as I recall, it had a bunch of typos and things like that, which we had to fix. But, the story was great.
I think that was the very first story that we accepted.
Exactly.
For Utopia Science Fiction. So that one we needed to have in.
Yeah, for history.
It was like the first submission I think that I'd read and said, yeah, this is worth publishing. This is what we're going to accept to start us off.
That's amazing. Yeah. Starting off strong. Yeah.
I always enjoyed, I think I mentioned Elena Gomel's piece earlier, which I still don't recall the name of, and this is bad, but I have no memory. And I also loved Jason Bartle's Solar Bear Plunge, which we published a while ago. It was a tight story. The writing was good, the story was good, the characters were good. It was one of those pieces that would be really nice to publish in some anthology, maybe down the road, maybe the 10-year anthology. We can...
Another story that pops to mind was Avra Margheriti, her something like The Chief Mason's Wife. very interesting sort of supernatural fantasy that turned out to be this very interesting other planet that they were on. And I still think about that one too. I also am not sure if that made it into the anthology, but I do remember recommending it. And she's very poetic and very interesting. Usually writes horror, from what I can tell.
So speaking of that story, that was what inspired the cover art for our February 2023 issue.
Oh, yeah. I see.
Good.
Yeah, and that particular cover I posted that on some of our social media accounts, and people loved that. They just kept reposting it and passing it around. I think those kinds of really striking pieces of art on the cover do a lot to get your magazine noticed. So that one was really helpful.
Yeah, we have some amazing cover art. At least half of it is, if not more, has been done by Jonathan. So huge thanks for that.
Yeah.
Well, like one of my favorite backstage things every year is that we run the art contest as an annual thing. And I love just like getting to go through and look through all the submissions. And I always feel terribly unqualified because I am not a visual artist at all, but getting to pick the winners of that art contest and then seeing the winner of the art contest every year on the December cover is always really cool.
One of the other things that I'm proud of is just the charities that we're able to donate. Every December, we have the special art issue, and we've chosen a charity to donate to help artists in need, veteran artists, people who are trying to keep their cultures alive. And I think it's important to take that kind of active role, not just publish stories about hopeful utopias, but to at least do some other kind of financial contribution in some part to organizations that are helping to make that reality today, or at least are helping to preserve culture.
And I don't know if we've chosen a charity for that yet this year, but I do remember last year it was a Ukrainian artists organization, right?
Yes, I think we did one special issue. I don't remember when it was. That was a charity to a different cause, but yeah, it's important to be able to do that, I think.
I mean, it's just so cool to me that we've been doing this for 5 years. For having a fairly niche mandate for the magazine, like the fact that we only publish utopic works, the fact that we also like have themed issues, and there's still new imaginative things that we're getting, right? The fact that people still submit to us with things that we've never seen before, like futures that we have not yet imagined, that to me is just like so hopeful. And the really big thing that makes 5 more years of this worth it for me is I'm like, okay, what new futures are people going to think up in this time? And like, how cool is it that can still be happening?
Yeah, absolutely.
A question I have for all of you is, and this kind of goes for myself as well, is what is something new that you'd like to try to do personally, not necessarily for the magazine to do, but something you'd like to do for it?
That is a good question.
I'm excited that I'm running my first interview next year in 2024. We're gonna have an interview in the Cli-Fi issue that I'm running, and I'm excited to be trying out that.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm actually like really excited about this is inviting some of my friends and colleagues who are scientists to write nonfiction articles for us. And everyone that I have mentioned it to has said, oh, yes, I was a huge science fiction fan. Maybe they still are. Was a huge science fiction fan as a child, as a teenager in college. And that is what got me into science. So they see the value of science fiction as inspiration and a recruiting tool, for future scientists, which is one of the reasons that I really wanted to be involved with the magazine in general. But so being able to ask people that I know who are really kind of nerds like us, but in the science field to write about their work. I have a pretty long list. I don't know how many of them are going to actually agree to write it, but I may be doing more interviews. So I'm excited to try to them involved in that recruitment of future scientists through science fiction.
I think I'm really interested in like more outreach to artists and things like that for doing some of the cover work, or like noteworthy, because we've interviewed some great artists like Michael Whelan, James Gurney, and I'd love to continue that kind of tradition with finding some of the old masters that are still around and interviewing them, getting them maybe to do a bit of work for the magazine at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
And I think for me, not necessarily for the magazine, but something I've been wanting to get more into is the writing side of things.
Oh.
And it's one of the reasons that I took this on was basically a sort of practice for my own writing. So far, I haven't had much confidence in my own work.
I feel like if your writing is anywhere near as good as your artwork, it's going to be good.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not, you learn by editing. You learn by reading other things, how to self-edit and get better. And so I am sure that your writing will be fine.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a matter of just sitting down and forcing yourself to do it. Set a timer, right,
Yeah.
for 15 minutes. I mean, I think sometimes when you think of like a giant project, it's just so intimidating that starting is hard. So I like to do 10-minute spurts. So right now I did the insane thing of starting NaNoWriMo again. This is, I think, my 13th year. This is actually a science fiction story, though, this time. I just didn't finish it last year, so I'm starting in the middle. But I can't do more than like 20 minutes at a time. So, and then I have to sit down 4 or 5 times a day to get to the word count that you need. And today my total is 0.
Well, you still have a little bit of time, I'm sure.
Yes, it's only 4:30 where I am. Yes. So anyway, so that's my advice: is just take small bites, small steps.
I definitely think, just the self-discipline to set up a schedule to write every day, even if it's for 10 minutes, because I know my life can get really quite hectic. So it's difficult to find 10 minutes even. But once you've started and once you've said, okay, this is going to happen, and you start doing it regularly, it becomes a lot easier. Your writing becomes a lot better. And it really helps things. Even if establishing that is difficult, even 10 minutes a day is amazing and will help.
Yes. Yes, I totally agree.
All right. I think that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've put in to Utopia Science Fiction and for coming on to this podcast today. And for anyone interested in hearing a little bit more about the editors, there's interviews with, I think, most of us in the upcoming anthology. And that anthology will be an amazing way to help support us through year 6. There's also the special art issue coming, so lots of good things to look forward to. And I will see you all next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. If you like what you heard and want to support our mission to bring hopeful fiction and poems into the world, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon or checking out the latest issue at our website. We'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our Patreon patrons and all of the Kickstarter supporters who've helped make what we do possible. Thank you. And now, with the final goodbye, let us go with our usual refrain. Let us go onward, ever onward, onward through the impossible.